Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. I'm joined by my colleague Konstantin Romashko. Hello, Kostya.
Hello, Volodymyr. Thank you for having me here.
Today we are going to talk with you about food security, the role of Ukraine in global food supplies. It is not a secret that the current situation, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, has produced a global food crisis. Many countries in the world are suffering from the fact that Ukraine is a big supplier of food globally, and many countries in the world are now on the brink of food crisis and even famine. Today we are going to talk with you about this. So let me remind that Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the biggest and oldest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We are a small team of Ukrainian journalists based in Ukraine and working and explaining Ukraine to you during these dark times, during these difficult times. So, Kostya, let's talk about this in a moment. And just a first fact I would like to share with you. Ukraine is exporting about 90 million tons of foodstuff. 90 million tons of foodstuff every year. This is a huge amount. And according to some estimates, 400 million people all over the world are depending on Ukrainian food. Just imagine this.
Yes.
Ukraine has just about 40 million people of population, but 400 million people all around the world are dependent on Ukrainian food, primarily grain, primarily oil, sunflower oil, dairy products, etc. So this crisis, I think it shows how important Ukraine is for global food security. What do you think?
Yes. According to different experts, Ukraine is a key player here. And there are some factors that we should take into account when we're talking about food delivery across the world. First of all, we should take into account the volumes of goods that are being bargained. If we are speaking about the international trade, some experts say that Ukraine's share in international trade is, for example, if we are talking about some products, is 10% of wheat, 25% of corn, and more than 50% of sunflower oil. Some experts say, okay, it's 46%. But this is a great volume, this is a great amount of products that are being delivered across the world markets. That is why the key point in this regard is the fact that Ukraine cannot be substituted with regard to the import of goods to the country, which imports is in urgent need. So there is no alternative to Ukraine if we are talking about the specific goods that are being imported by concrete countries.
Well, when we were preparing this talk, we have talked to three Ukrainian experts, very well-known Ukrainian experts in agricultural trade, agricultural productions. These are Taras Kachka, who is Ukraine's trade representative, a person who knows everything about Ukraine external trade. This is also Taras Vysotsky, who is the first deputy minister for agriculture. Taras Kachka is first deputy minister for economy. And we also talked to Volodymyr Lapa, who is the advisor of the president of Ukrainian Club of Agrarian Business, also well-known personality. So they all confirmed to us this fact, how much Ukraine is exporting. And Kostya, what you said, it's very important that Ukraine is very difficult to substitute because there are many other big producers of foodstuff. There is Russia, for example, or China. But China, for example, it works for its own market primarily. Russia also is not as big exporter as Ukraine is. So Ukraine is the second largest exporter of grain, for example.
Yes.
And therefore that foodstuff that Ukraine puts on the market, it's very difficult to substitute because it is foodstuff which is externally traded. So why it is important? It is important primarily on those countries which are importing this foodstuff from Ukraine. So let's talk about geography. If we talk about the countries who are dependent on Ukrainian food exports, what countries would you name?
Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, Mediterranean countries, Middle East countries, primarily the Arabic world, and sub-Saharan Africa. Though these countries are the most dependent on food delivery from Ukraine.
Interestingly enough, when you see on this geography, that's what we are calling global south, actually. So in Ukrainian debates, this is now a very widespread topic, is that who supports us? We are supported primarily by the Western world, by the global north, by European Union, by United States, by Canada, by Australia and New Zealand. But what about global south? What about Africa? What about Asia? And the paradox is that global south is much more dependent on Ukraine than global north. That if we talk about Ukraine as a resource rich country, we are primarily talking about African countries, the Maghrebian countries, the sub-Saharan Africa, which is very important, and Asia, such countries as Iraq, Iran, Arabic world, and Southeast Asia. So the developing more world of the Southeast Asia. So it's very important because to some of these countries, Russian propaganda is reaching out. Of course, we are talking about primarily Maghreb, primarily sub-Saharan Africa, Asian countries, trying to show, okay, this is because of the Western sanctions against Russia that you have this food crisis, that you have the rise of prices, etc. But the real explanation is that it is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Absolutely.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which produced this crisis. Why Russian invasion of Ukraine produced this crisis, Kostya?
We are talking about these countries that are suffering the most from Russian aggression, from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We were talking about Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, and so on and so forth. But of course, we should not forget about the Europe. One of the implications of food crisis is the rise of prices in Europe. And many experts, for example, Voldemar Lapa says about that, the prices on sunflower oil in Germany has risen so much. The blockade of all our ports that is now being held is one of the main factors that hampers the food delivery to the rest of the world. And when we are talking about our ports, there are 4 key ports to export, for example, grain. 3 are located in Odessa neighborhood and 1 in Mykolaiv port. If we, with the help of the world, unblock these ports, then the situation may be addressed in the world.
Let us explain to our listeners one important element is that Ukraine is a rich country, is a big country. It has a big Black Sea coast. Before 2014, well, our coast, Black Sea coast, was ours. The Crimea was Ukrainian. Of course, we strongly believe that Crimea is legally Ukrainian and it will be Ukrainian in reality very soon or sometime. But now it's occupied by Russia. And when Russia occupied Crimea, it started also to occupy the Sea of Azov and primarily block the Sea of Azov, the not so big sea near the Black Sea, and the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk. So some years ago already it was difficult for Ukrainian ships or international ships to navigate in the Sea of Azov. Russians were illegally blocking it. Now what's going on right now after this full-scale invasion? Russians have captured Mariupol, made a genocide there, a mass massacre. Dozens of thousands of people seem to be dead. We don't know the exact figures. This is one of the biggest tragedies of the 21st century. Also, the ports of Berdyansk is also captured. So these are important ports, and also Kherson, which is a big southern Ukrainian city, which is also captured by the Russians. Although they are important, they play about 10% of Ukrainian agricultural exports. The major exports are coming, as Kostya said, through these 4 ports. Mykolaiv and 3 ports around Odessa. The Odessa, the Pivdenny port, and Chernomorsk. Pivdenny port is actually the biggest one, is 50 million tons. So the question is that although they are not occupied, although they are not destroyed as Mariupol, ships cannot enter these ports or go from them because the Black Sea around them is mined, because there
Yes.
are Russian warships that are in the Black Sea. They are basically, there is a risk that they will open fire, for example. So what Ukraine is saying that, look, we need an operation, either a diplomatic agreement, or basically we don't really believe in diplomatic agreements with Russia. We need military deblockade, to militarily deblocade the Black Sea from the Russian military presence. And it is also not only Ukrainian concern, but also concern of other Black Sea countries, including NATO members like Turkey, Bulgaria, or Romania. So this is important element, right? And we need to stress it. So that Russian invasion really played such a big role for the global food security. So what's happening in Ukraine? Ukraine cannot export, can barely export its food. What will happen if Ukraine does not export its food, Kostya?
Over the last 15 or 20 years, Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian railway operator, and Ukrainian ports have been the key tools to deliver goods to the specific countries and to export the foods. Now, all the foods, because of the fact that our Ukrainian ports are being blocked, all the foods stay in our ports. So the situation
Not the ports,
But
but the storage.
in the
storage
storages,
systems.
yes.
So you meant Ukrzaliznytsia played a very important role because the infrastructure, infrastructure, was
Transport
so
infrastructure and ports, but
that
even
yeah,
though
but it,
even though Ukrzaliznytsia is not enough to deliver goods and products directly to the countries, so there is an urgent need to unblock the ports to deliver the goods and the products already to the countries in need.
so what's happening now, and this is what our interlocutors tell us, so this is what Taras Kachka, trade representative, told us, also Taras Vysotsky, the deputy agricultural minister, that while Ukraine is now storing its grain in the storage and cannot export, the question will be what will happen with the next harvest. So despite the war, Ukrainian farmers, those incredible Ukrainian farmers who, as you have seen many times, stole Russian tanks with their tractors, they also succeeded to seed their fields during the spring. So we are expecting a harvest in autumn, in late summer and autumn. What will happen to this harvest if the storages are now full with the food that we did not export? They will just stay on the fields. And the next year we will not have any harvest. So the problems for the world and for Ukraine, by the way, will increase dramatically next year. And there is one thing that reminds me of, Kostya, is what happened 100 years ago during the Holodomor, the artificial famine against Ukrainian peasants. Because as you remember, and there are now parallels because Russians are stealing and confiscating Ukrainian grain in the newly occupied territories of the southern Ukraine. And they are using the same language as expropriating the surplus of harvests, as they say. But if you remember the history of Holodomor,
Yes.
it was not only a story of 1 year. So first they confiscated the harvest, then there was nothing to seed, and then there was nothing to get from the harvest. So unfortunately, this problem can last.
How should this problem be addressed in this regard? Who should take the responsibility, or with the help of whom Ukraine can address this problem?
There is a diplomatic option, we should find a compromise with Russia, and for example, Russia says lift sanctions from Russia, and then we'll deblock the Black Sea. And this is a blackmail. The blackmail in the Black Sea, right? So this is a blackmail because Russia started this crisis. Russia started this war. Russia is culpable, should be condemned not only for this immense Ukrainian suffering, but also of the situation on the global food markets. And it says, okay, well, let's solve it, but first you need to lift sanctions from Russia. So there is a debate that Russia says lift sanctions against Russian fertilizers, and this will deblockade the situation of the global food markets, which is of course nonsense. Another option is military deblocade, and this is where Ukrainian pleas for anti-ship weapons are so important. And as they might be coming to Ukraine these days, these weeks, these months, we hope really that Ukraine will succeed in posing a military threat for Russian ships. And the second issue is, of course, to engage a third country or third countries for the military ships to convoy the trade ships in the Black Sea. Because we understand that even if there are no Russian ships in the Black Sea, they can still attack the Black Sea with the rockets, missiles elsewhere, like from the Caspian Sea or from the skies. And therefore, what is needed is that military ships, NATO military ships or some other countries, will need to accompany the trade ships which are going to Ukrainian ports or from Ukrainian ports. Let me repeat that Ukrainian ports which are able to export are still there. They are good ports. They are functioning. But what is needed is really to ensure the safety of navigation. Kostya, you wanted to say something?
Just one remark. I wanted to add that the blockade of Ukrainian ports affects not only the food situation with regard to Ukraine, with regard to the rest of the world, but also across all Black Sea region, because we should not forget about that in a long-term impact it will have on the bargain of grains originated not only from Ukraine, but also from Romania, from Kazakhstan, or even from Russia. The long-term implications of Russia's blockade will have devastating impact on all the Black Sea region. If we are talking about this region, not only Africa, Turkey, Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa.
As you see, how important Ukraine appears to be for the global economy. Let me repeat this point, for the global agriculture. Not only because Ukraine seems to be irreplaceable in many aspects, primarily in grain, in wheat, in barley, in sunflower oil, in which the Ukrainian percentage is from 10% to 50%. But the absence of Ukrainian exports, as Kostya, you rightly said, led to dramatic increase of prices worldwide. And for European countries or for rich countries, it is probably, well, it's a problem, but it can be solved. But for poorer countries like sub-Saharan countries,
Yes.
sub-Saharan Africa, which cannot pay big money, the increase of prices, sometimes we see the 50% increase of prices for some products, foodstuff. This is very dramatic.
What do you think? Was it initial aim of Russia to trigger global food crisis?
Well, I think the initial goal was to weaken Ukrainian economy. We also asked this question to one of our experts, Volodymyr Lapa, and his position is that the primary aim was to weaken Ukrainian economy, of course, to cut Ukraine from its key export capacities. They destroyed Mariupol, which is a key steel-producing city, and they're now blocking Ukrainians from exporting our agriculture, which is the second largest sector of Ukrainian economy, or even the first largest. But of course, they're also triggering the world crisis, the global crisis. And let's see this situation in a perspective. They first, in the autumn, they triggered the global energy crisis by pushing the gas prices to enormous level and not willing really to act on the market and to put the surpluses of the gas they had. Now they did the same with the global food prices. So Russia is a global disruptor. Russia is a country which tries to destabilize the world in any possible means, politically, in the energy field, and now in the field of the food security. Let's not forget it.
Totally agree.
Let's sum up, Kostya. So this was our podcast in which we try to explain the global importance of Ukraine in this situation. And as you can see, Ukraine appeared to be, because of this crisis, Ukraine appeared to be a vital country for the whole world, primarily for the world which is dependent on Ukrainian foodstuff. And these are primarily those countries which are not that rich, which are less rich, let's say, than Europe or Northern America. And it is also very important for the global situation and for the fight against poverty, etc. And solving this issue, of course, it demands also the global effort. And as we said, solving this issue needs to imply military action. This was a Explaining Ukraine podcast by UkraineWorld.org. My name is Holodomor Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. I'm joined by my colleague Kostya Romashko, who is a head of analytics department at Internews Ukraine. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, which is one of the oldest and largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, on YouTube. Follow us, stay with us. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. And majority of your support goes to our humanitarian actions. We support people who suffer from this war. We also support Ukrainian resistance. So thank you for aiding us, for helping us to do that. Patreon.com/UkraineWorld. So stay with us and stand with Ukraine.
Thank you, with Ukraine. Bye-bye.